Hi, I'm Kyle Parrish, and welcome to Make Sure Your Disaster Recovery Plan works when you need it. I'm hoping that all of you all find this valuable. I think that disaster recovery and business continuity are things that are all at top of mind right now with the current situation. And so for us to, for me to be able to share this information with you is pretty exciting. So thanks for coming. And at the end, there'll be a Q&A, and I'd love to answer any questions you may have. So as we all know, adverse events are always out there, right? I mean, you got hurricanes, tornadoes. Cognizant just got attacked by malware, people who just make mistakes. And lastly, of course, there's always the guy who cuts the fiber with his ditch witch, right? Which we think that's not that common, but believe it or not, construction can create a disaster. So these things happen a lot in our environments, and we don't realize that. But before I talk about that, here's one thing I want to say. Nothing I say or show during this presentation represents the opinion of my employer or any employer I've ever had in the past or anything else. This is an aggregation of my experiences. And so these are things that I've learned along the way. These are things I've seen, things I've read about, and everything here is based on best practices and a pretty long career in IT. So I stand behind what I say for me, but don't attribute it to my employer. As I said, disasters are more common than you think. So in 2017, Gartner did a study and found that 80% of businesses experienced an incident in the past 2 years that require the use of their DR plan. And that's a big deal because DR plans aren't incidents. DRs are DRs. They are disasters which require you to go to an alternate environment and put together alternative working processes most of the time. There are steps that are required in order to build your environment back in a disaster. And if you don't plan, it can be tough. As 50%, right? Half of those same companies had 2 or more DR events. I mean, that's significant. These are, and now that goes maybe to the management of their IT in some ways, or just bad luck. But either way, if you're part of it, you need to be prepared. And that's what we want to talk about today. DR events are company killers. Let's be honest. I mean, if you get an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado and it wipes out part of your data center or your whole data center, or if you just get knocked offline and you're not prepared, it can actually end your business. So according to a study at the University of Texas, 94% of companies suffering from a catastrophic data loss don't survive. I mean, that is stunning. You think about it, if you had 100 companies, only 6 of those that had a catastrophic data loss, like a significant event, are going to make it out. I mean, that's brutal. 93% that lost data center for 10 days or longer were gone, right? File for bankruptcy. They may come back in a different form, but it shows the importance of IT and maintaining the integrity of your infrastructure, maintaining your applications, supporting your business, because these disasters can actually wipe your business off the map, costing people their jobs, costing the owners their dreams, the whole works. So they can be brutal. But there's great news. 96% of those who actually have disaster recovery plans and solutions in place can make it back. So think about that flip. 94% without them fail. And of course, take all of these statistics with a grain of salt. They're individual studies, but 94% that don't have plans fail. That's stunning. But 96% that have spent time in planning make it. And you want to be part of that 96%. And I'm not saying it's an easy task that we're going to go through, but the thing is, it is a task that is worth it. It's worth the investment in both time and resources to make sure that you're prepared for those unlikely events. So the key to emerging from a disaster is planning. I mean, plan, right? Be prepared. And in order to do that, there's a set of things that I believe are very important for this cause. The first is you need to understand your business. And as IT people, oftentimes we overlook this. right? As technologists, we overlook the fact that we really need to understand our business. And I'm going to get into this much deeper soon in the presentation, but the fact is all of our businesses are tied to key processes. IT is supports a business, not the other way around. Business does not support for us to have, it does not exist for us to have IT. IT exists in order to support business. We must know our business. Yeah. Next is you got to understand all those key processes, but you also have to understand your applications and your data that support those. So you need comprehensive inventories of those things, which means you've got to have like a configuration management database. Smaller companies, it can be less formal. Enterprises need to have processes and procedures in place to track thousands of servers and applications. Same with data. You need to know where your data is. You need to know what your databases are supporting. You need to know how many applications use a particular database or how many databases are required for a certain application. That inventory is vital. Third, based on those key processes, you need to establish a clear prioritization of efforts. In other words, when a disaster happens, you only have so many people and so much time. So you better know what your people should be doing when a disaster happens. What key processes should they be focused on? What are the processes they don't need to focus on? What can happen on day 2, 3, 4? Fourth, those prioritizations need to be followed by procedures. This is kind of where the real plans come into place. Both people and technology. So you can't ignore the people aspect of this and just have how I'm going to restore a system. You got to know that you're going to have people there, or if certain people aren't there, what you're going to do. Then deploy a comprehensive testing strategy. All of this is great, but you need to test. And then lastly, make continuous improvement organic. Make the continuous improvement loop part of your daily process in disaster planning. So I know that's a lot, but we're going to jump into it now and talk about each of those steps and kind of what is required for each of them. And of course, this is only like a 30, 40-minute presentation, so we're not going to be able to deep dive into this every single step, but I'll do the best I can to give you an overview so that you have a direction to go by the end of this to make sure that your disaster plan works. So on we go. First, I want to introduce everybody to 2 key terms. And these are vital. If you do any reading about disaster recovery, you're going to find, and business continuity, you're going to find these terms. They're critical. Those are RTO and RPO. So whenever a disaster event occurs, 2 key things are measured and 2 key things are used to determine whether you were successful in recovering. We'll talk about RTO first, which is recovery time objective. What this is, it's the amount of time given to recover your process or application after the disaster event is declared. So it is from the point, if a disaster occurred now, I have 30 minutes or I have an hour or I have 8 hours to recover my business process and my applications, databases, and everything else that supports it so that I'm back to functioning. That is RTO. RPO is recovery point objective, and it is specific to databases. What it is prior to a disaster event occurring, you have to think about data coming into your systems. Coming in, churn, 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 right? Here comes the data. Well, when a DR event occurs, have you committed all of that data up to that point? Or was your commit 15 minutes before? Or was your backup from the previous day? How much data can you afford to lose that was coming in prior to the DR event? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? Is it a day? You need to talk with your business about that. You need to talk to your business about both of these things. A lot of people think, these are technical problems to solve. They are technical in their implementation, but the requirements are driven straight out of the business. So let's move on, because there are a few more key terms I want to talk about here, just so that we level set as we go into disaster recovery planning. Incident. An incident can be a lot of things, but an incident isn't always a DR. So if you think about it, a DR is always an incident, but an incident isn't always a DR. An incident could be a router fails or a hard drive fails or something that you have to recover, but it's not going to force you to go to your disaster recovery plan. Lots and lots of incidents happen all the time. Don't get incidents confused with DR. DR are significant events that are called when they happen. This is a disaster. Let's go to our disaster recovery plan. An incident is managing something that happened. Secondly, BCP, business continuity planning. Now, we're not going to get into that in any depth here in this discussion, but it will be part of what we're talking about because business continuity planning is directly tied to disaster recovery. Business continuity planning is kind of the overarching process of which disaster recovery is a result. Business continuity planning is your business process and how you would use people, premise, and process to support your business in some kind of event. However, it is not the technical aspect. That is disaster recovery. Criticality rating. When I was talking about RTO and RPO, we're going to need to prioritize. We'll talk about this in a little bit. You're going to establish a criticality rating, and that will help you to prioritize. It can be A, B, C, D. It can be 0, 1, 2, 3. It really doesn't matter, but you're going to want to establish a criticality rating for your business processes and your applications and your databases so that you know what are most important. SLA is a service level agreement. Oftentimes you will have vendors that you're working with, or you will have customers and you will have SLAs. You need to make sure your SLAs are aligned to what you can recover your environment in, that type of thing. But keep in mind, service levels are not RTOs. Service levels can be like 5 nines. A lot of people think of it in those terms as I have to be up 99.999% of the time. That is not an RTO. An RTO is the amount of time you recover in a single event. A service level agreement is the amount of availability you have over time or when a particular process has to complete on a given day or something like that. Don't get those, like incidents and SLAs, don't get those two terms confused with RTO. And lastly, we're going to transition into this is BIA. That's business impact analysis. Now, what's a business impact analysis? It's the work you do in order to establish the criticality rating, which is the data that is fed in to create an RTO. We'll talk about business impact analysis in a minute, but it is the driver of your DR prioritization. So, as I said at the beginning of this, knowing business and technology is critical. You cannot be successful in disaster recovery or business continuity planning in business continuity planning, you can just know the business. In disaster recovery, we don't have that luxury. Your disaster recovery plans have to be business aware. Business is why we have jobs, not technology, right? Applications and data stores are the foundations for the business. So, a successful disaster recovery plan requires the people who write it to understand the business they're supporting. So out of this, you need a prioritized list of business processes. We've talked about that. And a business impact analysis exercise will help us get that. We need a full accounting and rating of the infrastructure and applications. That's the RTO. So coming out of this, there's a couple things. Business process will have an RTO. How long before we must recover a business function? Some of that is not going to require technology. For example, you may have alternative manual ways of doing certain work that you can get up and running in 2 hours, let's say. But with your technology, to get back to fully functioning, that might take 4 hours. So your RTO for the business process may be 2 hours to get your business up and running, but to get it fully functional, 4 hours. So you need that full accounting and rating for your infrastructure and applications based on the latter, on what they need from the technology support. Next, databases are critical. As we all know, most applications do not do anything without their underlying databases. For example, logging in, right? Most people's credentials and passwords and everything else are inside of databases. So even though you have a page that says, hey, I want to log in, if you don't have the database that holds the credentials or the passwords or the authorization data, you're not going anywhere. Same thing with account data. It's normally stored in a giant database. So those databases need to be rated for how long it takes to recover them, right? The RTO, as also how much data can be lost prior to the event, the RPO. Because even if you recover in the proper amount of time, but your RPO, which was that return point objective we discussed, is too long, you're not going to have the data you need when you recover to effectively recover your business process. And lastly, and this is a hard part, I'm not going to lie, this is the most challenging aspect of disaster recovery, is you have to identify your cross dependencies. So what applications support what database, or what applications are supported by what databases are most important for that application, and also all of the business processes that any particular application database might support also. Because it's not uncommon, for example, the login example, where a single database and a single process or a single set of applications support many, many processes. So if you think about single sign-on in your organization, it supports a myriad of databases and applications. And it needs to be understood which those are, because if you miss it, you may not be able to recover. So, as I talked about, effective DR requires you to know your business. So let's go back to the beginning of that pyramid. Know your crown jewels. What are the crown jewels? They're the things that keep the lights on. They're the most important business processes. They're the ones that keep you making revenue, right? If you're losing, some companies, if they go down, they're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour, millions of dollars, you know? So when you're talking about massive, massive enterprises, what are the ones that keep the revenue coming? Which are the ones that will keep you out of legal trouble? Which are the ones that won't land you in the press where people are spreading information that can create reputational damage? These types of things. You need to understand those business processes. They are the crown jewels. Then you need to ask yourself, what is it going to take to keep those up and running? Because those are going to be the first thing you want to recover in any disaster. It's all based on what you can't afford to lose, right? If you can't afford to lose certain functions, and I'll just keep using, in the non-business sense, login. If you can't afford to use login, you need to architect your solution so that login never stops running, or you can recover it incredibly quickly. If you are a financial services company, you need to make sure that you can settle with the Federal Reserve or out to other places, because if you can't, you're not going to be able to get money. You're not going to be able to get overnight loans. You're not going to be able to get whatever you need to keep going. And this is where technology needs to understand and talk to the business. Also, what are the potential threats and vulnerabilities that to those crown jewels of which you need to be aware? Is it ransomware? Is it the threat of weather in certain areas? If you're in certain regions of the world, is it earthquake that could disrupt you? Is there a massive construction project that just started up next to your data center? All of these are potential threats, and then you need to assess, what are the vulnerabilities I have to my crown jewel processes that I need to mitigate? And this is a much deeper discussion around risk assessment or risk analysis, where you can actually come up with quantitative measures of risk. And I'm sure there's some classes out there on things like FAIR, which does quantitative risk analysis. But these are important to understanding the crown jewels, the potential threats to them, and any vulnerabilities they may have. And then lastly, what is the potential impact over time? So all of this is important too. Even though it might be a crown jewel, you may have some time to recover those. So it's understanding the context. Time is the defining characteristic of disaster recovery. It is how long does it take us to get things back working the way they're supposed to be? Or in some cases, what is required for us not to have any time lost with our most critical processes? So know your business, know your crown jewels. So we just talked about business impact analysis, and I realize this we went from a nice muted screen to a big bright chart, but this is really important for disaster recovery folks to understand. While this business impact analysis is normally not conducted by disaster recovery personnel, it is conducted by business continuity folks. It is the feeder into the disaster recovery process. So as you can see from here, you have two axes. One is impacts that occur on the left side, right? What are the business impacts? So it could be reputation, it could be financial, it could be legal and regulatory, it could be any of those things. And then the top axis, the y-axis, is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Now that may be different for your business. It may be immediate impact, 2 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is, but the concept is the same, right? We're going to identify what happens when a process stops functioning and across those vectors. So goes without saying, I think, but I'll say it anyway, which is the more highs you have over to the left, the higher priority a business is, right? So if the entire chart here was red, it would be an extremely high priority business function and most likely one of your crown jewels. If the entire grid was gray with none in it, then you would know that it would not be on the radar for fixing it at any point in time in the immediate future, right? If an event occurred and everything here says none, well, leave it to the end. We'll figure it out, right? That would be something like get the cafeteria up and running, right? It wouldn't really matter that much. You just have to bring your own lunch. All right. So how do you classify them? So saying you've got all those reds. Now we need to convert them. You've got red, yellow, green, or gray. You've got none, high impact, low impact, medium impact. You've got your grid. But you need to classify those in a more singular way. You need to be able to bucket all that together into a particular thing. So we've talked about RTO and we've talked about criticality code a little bit. So out of that business impact analysis, you would get an RTO and you would get a criticality rating. Here it's called priority rating. There's criticality also, but we would assign one. So if we go back to our previous slide, and this entire slide was red coming out of the business impact analysis, and it was all high, or it was, even day 1 was mediums, and then it went to high on day 2. It's very possible you're going to have your priority rating at 0 or 1. These are core critical types of things. These are things that absolutely have to stay up and running. These are your infrastructure, without a doubt, right? You've got to have your routers, your network, that type of thing running. But this is also things, your main service to the world. So these things that are active, that cannot fail, that if you lose a data center, the other data center will pick up the work immediately. Those are going to be set at a priority rating of 0 or A. And that's going to tell people these are our most critical processes. As we go down, we assign 1, 2, 3, 4 to the processes and ultimately supporting applications in their core path. And it tells you, is it core critical? Is it business critical? Or all the way at the end, like the cafeteria, non-critical. we'd like to get it going, but it's not going to make a difference. And I love this quote over on the left-hand side. If everything is important, then nothing is. Here's a challenge you will face with your business users. I guarantee you. You're going to have a conversation with them and you're going to say, well, why are you core critical? And they're going to give you an explanation that doesn't make a whole bunch of sense. And even their business impact analysis is not going to be all highs or mediums. And yet they are going to want to be critical. And what you need to keep in mind is, if everything is important, then nothing is. It is incumbent upon the DR team and the business continuity team in partnership to test the business to make sure that they aren't just trying to make themselves important because they want to be important or think they are important. They need to objectively actually be important. Because remember, in a disaster situation, you need to have your priorities straight, and you can't fix everything at once with limited time and resources. So be aware, I warned you, you're going to have some battles with the business about how important their application is. And you want to make sure that you don't tell them their application isn't important, but you do need to make sure that they understand in the context of the whole organization, their need for immediate care might not be as high as they think. And they might go from being a 0 to a 2 or a 1 to a 3. And that's something you have to determine. But coming out of this, you will have a list of your most important applications and business processes. So you need standards too. And these standards are how you mark things, categorizations. So we just talked about priority ratings of 0, 1, and 2, and things are critical. And as you can see, the criticality remains the same: core critical, business critical, critical, down to non-critical. As DR folks or even process folks, we need to align that to what does it mean in terms of time. So you need to select a standard for your organization that is appropriate for your RTO or your recovery time objective for each of the priorities. So that way you have buckets. And so you have priority rating of 0, let's say, that means 0 downtime. Means it's got to run all the time, can't go down. An example of that from a healthcare perspective and an infrastructure perspective or is a ventilator, right? You cannot have ventilators periodically stop, right? They have to run all the time. It's a 0 downtime thing. But the TV that's in the room in a hospital can be non-critical. I mean, sure, everybody wants one, but if the TV breaks, it's nothing compared to something that's keeping a patient alive. Same with our business processes. Keep in mind, what are the things that keep your business breathing? Set those time frames and assign them to your applications and your business processes. Again, business continuity is going to establish the business process RTO, but for disaster recovery, those RTOs are going to be assigned to your applications and databases, and they need to be accurate, and they also need to be reasonable. So we've talked a lot about the business RTO and understanding the business and the crown jewels and all that, but we're, for the most part, IT people. I'm an IT people. Know a lot about the business, but not as much as the business people do. I do know a lot about the technology, maybe not as much about that each individual technology stack does, but I do know that our technology in a digitized world is critical to the business. And that we go back to the relationships, what we're trying to support is the crown jewel. And those relationships are the applications, databases, and other things like SaaS apps from vendors that support that crown jewel. We need to know that technology. So the applications, the databases all have many, many relationships. If you think about it, you've got a business process, and I'll take, I don't know, let's take a money movement, right, from financial services aspect. In order to move $100 from your one checking account to the other, let's make it a very simple example. You have to log into your bank. Well, application one is your login, right? And then application two is something that goes back and grabs your authorization. Application three goes back and grabs your balances, your account list and your balances. And it's actually application four, which allows you to take that balance and move it across those accounts. All of those called databases that had that information in there. They had your login information, they had your account information, they've got your name and address information, they've got your balances information, that kind of thing. In order for us to restore that in a DR, we have to understand that to move money, all of those applications need to be up and running, and they need to talk to each other, and they need to be brought up in the sequence that's most appropriate to bring them back to life. So protecting the business means knowing your technology. So as we talked about before, you've got to have a comprehensive inventory, and you have to have the relationships fleshed out. Of course, more and more nowadays, our on-prem solutions or the data centers solutions that we own are being farmed out. So you have critical processes that live in the cloud. We're not going to get into this that much because keep in mind, well, and I'll add this, your RTO, your business criticality, your ratings, and all of that do not differ because you move something to the cloud. You may have different options for services to help you meet those RTOs and your criticalities, but just because you're moving to the cloud does not mean that you are going to change them or have a different classification. The cloud is a data center in the sky, for lack of a better word. So therefore, you need not worry about it as the cloud. Where you do need to worry about it is in the vendor space, in that your visibility from a DR and inventory and even your testing perspective that we'll talk about later to verify your DRs might bring challenges that are outside of the scope of this conversation, but they might bring challenges, which are that you have contracts in place, and that's your transparency into your cloud. That is very different than you being able to call up your asset management team and determine what kind of assets you have. But you have to know the technology that supports that crown jewel, and that is the primary function of DR. So again, we just talked about the criticality, and now that you know your technology, you have to architect it, right? So you've got to architect these things appropriately based on the criticality code. So if you think about application architectures and database architectures, they map back to those priority ratings we set. So if you have a priority rating of 0, which is the most critical, all those applications and databases need to be built to be active-active, or in the case of database, multi-master. Because if you have a failure of an entire data center, let's say, you're not going to have time in a core critical environment to go spin up your second instance. However, as you move down the priority ratings, you can go, let's say, application space, active hot, right? So it's there, but it's not really waiting. You've got active warm, then cold, right? Which is you actually have to go in and manually bring it up. So you save money in these instances because maintaining active is very expensive. Maintaining multi-master database architectures are very expensive. When you think about databases that are spread across geographies, latencies come into play, which means it's harder the further away things are to maintain data integrity in a failure if your data centers are 1,000 miles apart. So each of these things needs to be architected. You work with your architecture teams to do this. So as a DR team, what you do is you build the standards. So you say, as we had talked about before, we have a priority rating of 0. That means that we can have 0 downtime. And it means it's the most important thing. It needs to be the top of the heap. And the architecture team says, okay, knowing that, we are going to build an active set of front ends that talk to a bunch of services that are spread across a couple of data centers, and they're going to have traffic management in between. and multi-master databases that are keeping everything in sync. And for each of these, your architecture team should come up with patterns that then development teams can use to assure that their applications and their priorities ratings are met and that the business need is served. Now, how do you know if all this stuff is working, right? How do you know if what you are supporting and building is actually going to do what it's supposed to do in a failure? Well, the first piece of this is you need to identify what metrics really matter, because the old Peter Drucker, one of the greatest management writers of all time, said you can't manage what you don't measure. And I absolutely believe this, right? If I don't understand what's going on in my environments, it's very difficult for me to manage them. In DR, this is particularly the case. And it's not, again, this is one of the not easy things about this. So let's talk quickly about, as you can see, there's our favorite terms, RTO and RPO, right? So recovery time objective, as you recall from before, is the amount of time after an event we have in order to recover our systems and our business function. Our PO was recovery point objective, which was the amount or the time of data, the amount of data we could lose, or the time of data we could lose prior to the event happening. Now, those are two key metrics in measuring the success of a disaster recovery plan, right? And so we have RTA and RPA. So it's recovery time objective and recovery point objective. So that is recovery time achieved and recovery point achieved. And there's two ways really to get those recovery time achieved and recovery point achieved numbers, so you can compare them to your goal. So RTO and RPO are the times that you've set prior that the business has stated. RTA and RPA are the things that you can actually do. One way of finding RTA and RPA is by running comprehensive tests, right? Actually failing over. We'll talk about testing in a minute. The other is, oops, you have an actual incident. And when that incident occurs, you actually capture the RTA and RPA from there to tell you what actually happened, right? These are two vital statistics. You need to know whether you can meet your RTO and your RPO, because if you can't, then you're actually putting your company at risk. The next one, throughput achieved greater than throughput required. Keep in mind, when you are, and these are not by any means a comprehensive metric list. This is an example, right? There's many metrics that you can have, but we don't have the time here, and some of them may not be appropriate for your situation. Who knows? So I just picked a few. But throughput achieved is greater than throughput required. When you have a transaction-heavy application, you need to know that if you lose half of your infrastructure or 3/4 of your infrastructure or whatever, that you can actually maintain the throughput that you had prior. So I'm going to use a two-site example here, which is a primary site and a secondary site that we're operating in active mode. So you're going along, you've got customers coming in, and you've got one data center in New York and you've got another data center in Los Angeles. I'll just pick two US cities way apart. And so East Coast, West Coast, and people are basically, traffic's coming in, boom, 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 boom. Then all of a sudden in New York, there's some kind of disaster. There's a flood. Your data center gets wiped out. Next thing you know, everybody's going to Los Angeles. Is Los Angeles going to be able to handle the volume that is coming through? That is also critical in DR. What you don't want to do, or if your criticality rank warrants it, you do not want to be in a situation where your architecture or your infrastructure will not support your customer base. You need to know that you can fail over. Lastly is, make sure you have validated DR plans. And this is made out of two things. One is there's a plan, an actual document or a site with the materials in it, whatever it is, a SharePoint, you can use vendor solutions for this, whatever it is, a Word doc. I don't recommend those things, but you can go across the gamut. But there needs to be a plan that's written down. Validated means it needs to have been tested. And this is vital because, and it's a crushing metric to have if you don't, if it's not fulfilled. Because when you don't want to find out you have an untested DR plan is in a DR. So this is a harder one to check in many ways, but it's worth the effort to make sure that your most critical applications and even those secondary applications have DR plans in place and they've been tested recently. So those are just a sample of some metrics that you might want to take a look at. There's lots more out there. You can search the web. You could reach out to me and I could, help you with some metrics in the future if you need it. So lastly, not really lastly, but you got to know who you're going to need. Keep in mind who's actually going to build this stuff up. One of the things we haven't talked about is how plans get executed, and that's the people in the data center, it's people in your support center, it's your people, your application development managers, your infrastructure managers, bunch of different people. You need to know who those people are and what role they are going to play prior to any event. And they need to know that they are going to do that. So you need to create and maintain a comprehensive contact list of everyone that's involved with a particular disaster recovery plan to make sure that those people can be reached in the event of a disaster. Each of those people needs to have their roles, responsibilities, and deliverables defined prior, and they need to have accepted that, understand it, and be ready to go. They need to have dry run this thing. There's also the great single point of failure, SPOFs, right? There's always those really smart people, right, that make things go. They're the ones that everybody calls when something goes wrong. They're the ones that tend to be the hub of incident calls and that type of thing. You need to identify those people, and you need to make sure that you have a way to get around them in a disaster, because they may not be available. What if they're on vacation, right? What if they are on the other side of a bridge failure or something and they can't get to where it is and they can't log on because the cell towers are down? Whatever it is, you need to figure out what you're going to do with those single points of failure in order to mitigate them. And lastly, you need to document a decision tree. A lot of people think, so we'll take this and put it back in the context of RTO. So one of the things you'll also find most probably in your venture down disaster recovery is that RTO is a time measure that has nebulous beginning and ending times, which is kind of tough if you're measuring whether or not you're succeeding based on time and you can't really pick a beginning and ending time. That makes it really hard to measure. So the decision tree needs to have protocols in it which say who's in charge of what and under what circumstances, or who can a DR be called, right? You start RTO and RPO, or actually just RTO in this case, you start RTO clocks when someone officially calls a DR. So at the beginning of this thing, it may be that you're triaging a situation to figure it out, like a ransomware attack or something. You're like, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Well, you can't really count that against the disaster recovery time objective. It's when somebody goes, we're not going to be able to fix this. We need to go to our DR environment. Boom, that's when it starts. That becomes very difficult in a chaotic disaster situation if you don't have a set of protocols and a set of rules and people identified that are going to make the decisions. So for our quote heroes, which is what they're going to be in a disaster, maintain that list of contacts. Make sure that they understand roles, responsibilities, and deliverables. It's vital. Any single points of failure need to be identified, and we need to plan to mitigate them. Doesn't mean that we still don't love those people and that they're going to do an amazing job for us. What it means is if they are unavailable, we need to have a way to get around it. And lastly, just to remind you, make sure you have a way that decisions are going to get made in a disaster. It's chaotic in a disaster. Having something that says this is the way we're going to run is a huge benefit. So last but not always least, actually not least at all, is you need to test, test, test. And I love this. This guy's the most interesting man in the world, or at least that was the advertisement. And I think this is the funniest thing, because I've been in performance testing, and I've done a lot of continuous availability testing, chaos testing, the whole thing. And this meme always comes up, which is I don't always test, but when I do, I test in production. Guess what? In a disaster recovery scenario, you do not want to be testing in production. You do not want that to be the first time you have ever tried your DR test, right? It will, as we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, that could be an epic fail for your firm. It could put you out of business, right? So test, test, test. First, say you don't have a great protocol right now for doing a lot of testing in your environments. You can do tabletop testing. And what's tabletop testing? Tabletop testing is you sit around with all the principals, identify all the people that would be involved probably in a DR, come up with a scenario like ransomware or we lost a data center, and then walk through and say, what would you do? What would you do? How would we get this back? Have a conversation, draw things out of that, and then go back and replan. It's actually very valuable because it actually brings the stakeholders to the table. They understand what you're doing. You walk them through why it's important. And then as you move further down the road, you have stakeholders that are interested and you have stakeholders that will support you. So tabletop testing, while it sounds kind of trivial, can be a valuable exercise. Application level testing and integration testing are important. A lot of DR planning happens at the application level. We haven't talked about it and we don't have a lot of time, but the fact of the matter is while applications are atomic units, they are things that need to be restored, they are valuable in the context of the business process. And so integration testing becomes more important, where you have multi-application testing, and then ultimately down at the bottom of this, business process testing, which is end-to-end, right? As we talked about before, also capacity and performance, that throughput, you need to do significant capacity and performance testing to make sure that your secondary sites can handle the volume of both the primary and secondary sites in an event. Failover testing is driving that traffic and then shutting one side off. You can't do this in a lot of active environments sometimes, because you could actually create single points of failure of technology, not necessarily people. So use your brain, but failover testing can be invaluable. And lastly, user acceptance testing. So when you're doing that business process test to make sure that you've recovered it, when you get really mature with this process, have the end users participate in this. And by that, I mean the business people, not your customers, but have them participate to make sure that they believe the environment has been restored. And that means they will check to make sure that transactions have gone through and processes have happened and everything else, and that your entire stack is successfully restored for your DR testing. So wrapping this up, all of this is a lot of stuff, I realize. It all rolls back into, it's a process of continuous improvement. There is no done in disaster recovery planning, analysis, testing, all that type of thing. It's a process of continual improvement, right? And so, as Dan Millman said, and this was actually attributed to Socrates, but it was Socrates is actually a character in a book he wrote. So it's really this Dan Millman guy. But anyway, secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. This is so important in disaster recovery testing and planning. Well, disaster recovery planning. Keep in mind, disaster recovery planning is a forward-looking exercise. So looking at incidents that have occurred and that type of thing is important. However, it is not important in the context of understanding how those things were fixed. Root cause of incidents are important to inform your future vision for disaster recovery. So disaster recovery is a risk exercise. It's not an audit exercise. So in this, you need to analyze and understand your processes, design and plan for that future, then conduct all those tests I was talking about, capture the feedback, put them into a monitoring, reporting, and recommendation cycle, and then jam it right back into analyze and understand. Continually improve, continually improve, continually improve. Because for those of you who don't have plans now, or whose plans are at a low maturity, it's very important that you understand that getting to the point where you can do end-to-end business process testing is a long road. Initially, identifying the crown jewels is vital. Inventorying your applications and databases is vital, right? Then building plans at the application and the database level, even if it's individual applications, individual databases, is critical to understanding how you would bring up those systems in a disaster individually. You could write procedures to effectively bring up those individual pieces. Then you go and you build integration tests where you take a couple of those applications and plug those together and run tests. And eventually, when you've reached the utopian world of disaster recovery planning and testing, you can do end-to-end business processing testing. But it is an evolution. And just because it seems very overwhelming does not mean that you shouldn't start. And each day you can get a little bit better. So continual improvement is absolutely vital. So I'm going to summarize all this, and then I'll take some questions here. So to create a successful DR plan, we got to understand the business. I know I've labored that point, but I can't tell you how critical it is. Inventory the environments and processes. This may not be your job, but you need to demand that you have accurate inventories of both your environments and your processes, because without it, it's very difficult to effectively plan for DR. If you don't know what is being used, how are you going to make sure that it's prioritized and you have plans to restore it? Priority, priority, priority. In a disaster, you can't have everything important, because if it is, it's very possible you're going to spend your times on low value efforts. That is not what you want to do in a disaster. You want to know exactly what needs to be done. You need to understand that you're going to triage the problem, you're going to triage your systems, and you're going to save the most vital things first. In our work as disaster recovery folks, create your most important plans first. So when you have these crown jewels and all, don't start building disaster recovery plans for the things that don't matter because it's easier or whatever. Build the most important plans first, because disasters aren't going to wait for you to be ready. Disasters could happen at any time. So, and I mean, in this time of pandemic, while it's not a disaster, it definitely created a lot of business continuity problems. A lot of people said, well, we couldn't expect this. If you had a business continuity plan, you were probably in decent shape. If you didn't, it's created mad scrambles, right? So create your most important plans first. Again, next thing, test, test, test. Knowing whether or not your stuff is going to work is going to make your DR plan more and more successful. Every time you test, you're going to improve your DR plan by capturing issues, identifying risks, and continually improving. That is the summary. So I can't tell you whether your plan is going to work today, because I don't know your plan. What I know is that the more you work at it, the more you test, the better you prioritize, the better your inventory and your better understanding of your business, the better chance you have of having a successful DR plan that's going to work when disaster falls. So anyway, realize that was a lot to take in. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Any questions?